Hello everyone, I'm Dave Hart from the Winslow, Arizona Church of Christ, and I'm so happy that you've chosen to join me today. We are in the third lesson on a series entitled Why I Am a Member of the Church of Christ. Why I'm a member of the Church of Christ. But before we get into the lesson today, I want to do something a little different. I want to do a little book review. I want to give you some books that I think will really help you to understand the series of lessons that I'm giving even better. They'll talk about a lot of the things I'm talking about, but there'll be a lot more information also. So I'm going to suggest several. There's others out there that are very great books, but these are some of my favorites. And all these books can be bought through the 21st Century Christian Bookstore. The 21st Century Christian Bookstore. You can look them up on the internet. You can buy a lot of these books from other places, but I believe that this is the one place where you'll be sure to find all of them. And the first book I want us to look at is called A Muscle and a Shovel. A Muscle and a Shovel, written by a man named Michael Shank. And I've had some contact with Michael, and I tell you what, he's a great guy. This is a great book. And I remember when I first started hearing this book, people were bringing it up on my Facebook page. And at first, I'm a weightlifter, and A Muscle and a Shovel, I thought it was some kind of a weightlifting, bodybuilding book. But a lot of people were saying how great it was. Some were saying, other than the Bible, it was the greatest book they've ever read. And I figured by some of the comments and looking at some of the people, they probably weren't weightlifters. So I looked into this book and got this book, and it is a great book. I'd recommend every Christian to get this book and to read it, and then to pass it on to somebody who's not a Christian. If you can afford it, get several of them. There's been many, many, many people baptized because of reading this book, or at least part of the reason why was because of reading this book. In fact, right before I come over here tonight to do this lesson, I just saw where somebody else got baptized after they had read this book. It's a great book. If you haven't read it yet, please do, and then pass it on to somebody else. The next book I want to look at is called The Church of Christ. Church of Christ by Edward Horton. Another very great book. This book is one that is very good for somebody who's already become a Christian, or if you have somebody that wants to know more about becoming a Christian, or about the Church of Christ, or why we believe or teach the things that we do, things like Lord's Supper every week and no instruments of music. This is a great book for us to have to study so that we can answer questions, but also to pass this book on to somebody that might have some questions or might be wondering about some of the things that we believe and why we believe them and things like that. The next book, which is what I have named my series of lessons on, is called Why I'm a Member of the Church of Christ by Leroy Brownlow. And another very great book. Now, this is not necessarily as easy to understand or as easy to read as the other two books. This is one I would say would be better for somebody who's already in the church, already understanding some of the things that we do according to the Bible, and to get a deeper meaning and deeper understanding. And there again, it will be very helpful for those who are not Christians, for you to know this material, to be able to explain it better, what the Bible is actually saying. This book, I think, was written first in the 50s or maybe 60s, and it's just a very great book, and I really, really enjoyed this book, and learned some new things, and helped me to understand some things I already believed even better. The next book I want to look at is called Introducing the Church of Christ. Introducing the Church of Christ. Small book, not very expensive. And there again, this is a good book for those who are Christians, because what it is it's small articles, short articles by a lot of different preachers in the Church of Christ. A lot of different preachers have short articles in this book. And they do a very good job of explaining things And it's a very good book to get if you're in the church, to help you understand a deeper meaning of why we believe the things that we do. And we see this, there would be biblical reasons for this. They use the Bible. They have the Bible for everything that we teach and believe. And it is also a book that's fairly good to give to somebody that might wonder about why we teach the things we do, what makes us different from other churches, and why we believe the things we believe. Very good book. The next book, it's a little bit different from the other ones in that it is a reference book, a very, very good reference book. And all it is a lot of different Bible topics with Bible verses to go with them. For instance, if you're wondering what the Bible says about baptism, it'll give you just a whole list of verses about baptisms. This book is written by a man named Paul Sain. Very great book, very great preacher in the church. And this is just a wonderful, wonderful book. We are using this book for both our Sunday morning and Wednesday Bible classes, adult Bible classes. And we can just go through all kinds of topics and help new people and even some who've been around the church for a long time to understand the various topics that might come up in a better way, in a stronger light. So, just to give you a sampling, here is one about husbands, as husbands, Bible references about husbands. We have, just going through the book, false teaching, all kinds of things about false teaching, deceit, denominations, creation, all kinds of things. Wonderful reference book, both for your own learning and, there again, we're trying to evangelize somebody. They'll say, well, what does the Bible say about this or that? And even me being a preacher and having studied many years, something like this is very, very helpful to be able to go to it. Now, this is the deluxe edition. This is the deluxe edition, and I recommend the deluxe edition because there's a lot of extra helps in the back here, lots of questions and answers, things like that are not in some of the other editions. But it also comes in the Ready Reference edition for growing Christians. And this has all the topics of the other one, except it doesn't have the extra stuff in the back. And this is a fairly cheap book that you can get. This one here was $3.95. Wonderful book, just goes through all kinds of different topics and then gives you the Bible reference for those topics so you can do study on them. I recommend this book for personal study, for Bible studies, for one-on-one studies, and just to have around in case there again somebody wants to talk to you about a particular subject or topic. This book is wonderful to be able to just grab it and look it up, and let's just look up and see what the Bible has to say about it. So there again, these are not the only good books that are out there. There's many others, but these are some of my favorites, and I think that you would enjoy them, and I think that each of those books would be beneficial, and I really recommend getting each of those books for your home library. So, today's lesson, why I'm a member of the Church of Christ, we're going to be looking at worship. Because it has the right worship. Now, as you've been following me on the internet here, I did do a lesson on worship a few weeks back. So this will be kind of a review of that lesson, but there's also going to be new and added material. Be both a review, but there will be new and added material. So this series of lessons, I'm talking about why I'm a member of the Church of Christ, because there was a time in my life that I wanted to be sure I was in the right church and did an intense study of other churches. I actually went to schools that belonged to other churches and actually went to services of other churches and tried them out. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to be sure why I was a member of the Church of Christ. And also why I'm doing this series is because especially with this plague and so many people dying and all the terribleness that's going on right now, it got me to really thinking about those who have left the church. Those who have left the church. And I hope maybe some of those will be listening to this and help them to come back. But I also hope that this will help those who are in the church to stay in the church. Please stay in the Lord's church. I know there can be problems, there can be issues. I know that some of the other churches out there can look better, have better entertainment, things like that. But stay in the Lord's church, I'm begging you. That is where salvation is found. So last week I talked about, as I was looking at these other churches, trying to find ones that were right in God's sight, that were doing the things that God wanted them to do. And how would I determine if they were or not? I took the Bible. I went to their websites, some of their official websites, and I looked at what they were teaching, what they were believing, what they were practicing, and compared it to the scriptures. And as I've said before during this series, time and again, I was extremely disappointed. So last week I talked about salvation, what they taught when it came to being saved, how to be saved. And I talked about how important that was, that if you don't get that right, it doesn't really matter what else you get right. You can be a very religious person, you can be at church all the time doing good works. If you haven't obeyed God with what he has said when it comes to salvation, you're just a good religious person that's lost. So I already started there, but then secondly, most of the time, what I would look at is how they worshiped. Because I knew that worship was extremely important to God. We were created to worship God. And I also knew from the Bible that those who didn't worship God correctly received severe punishment for it. They were not accepted by God. Think about going all the way back to the first scene that we have in the Bible of worship. What's the first scene that we have? We have Cain and Abel, two brothers worshiping God. Now they were both worshiping God. They were both, understand that. It wasn't that one of them was and one of them wasn't. They were both worshiping God. But guess what? How those first two children, who undoubtedly had been told exactly what God wanted, one of them wasn't doing it right. And we know what that led to. We know what that led to. And I want you to understand that false worship always leads to bad things. Wrong worship always leads to bad things. You can look at the Israelites. Look at the Israelites. God set down the law. There was actually two different laws. There was the moral law, how man treats man. And there was the religious law, how man was to treat God. Same thing today. Same thing today. Now, if you study the Old Testament, you'll see that these people could slip pretty badly when it came to the moral law. They do things that were immoral. But as long as they kept the right worship, as long as they kept God in the right place, those nations did survive. Those nations kept going. Those nations were forgiven. And we can look at David, who was the leader of Israel. David, who was generally a very righteous, godly man, who did worship God in the correct way. I mean, most of the Psalms are written by David, and most of them are about worship in some point or another, aren't they? So we know that David was a great worshiper of God, but David did some very bad things, didn't he? He did some morally wrong things. But David would come back to his senses and clean up those moral things and keep on worshiping God. But those Israelites who started not obeying God with the religious law, it would always get worse and worse. And you can notice that. You can notice that they would start adding this or that, or taking this or that away, or changing this or that. And as time went on, they started doing that more and more, and their worship became more about paganism, more about what they wanted to do or what they didn't want to do. And when that became full-blown at some point, that is when God would bring destruction and death and pestilence and foreign armies in to take them over and all kinds of things, because he knew there wasn't any more hope for them. Once the religious law was gone and they weren't obeying it, there was no longer any hope for them to come back unless God gave them some kind of huge wake-up call. And those wake-up calls were never... How shall I put it? Those wake-up calls were terrible things. They were terrible things, but they were also good things in the fact that it would draw them back to God. It would draw them back to God. So it's the same thing today. We have the law of Christ. And there's a moral law that goes along with the law of Christ, but there's also a religious law that goes along with the law of Christ. And if we don't hold to that religious law, there's going to be dire consequences for us also. So worship is something that is vital for a Christian to do. There again, as I said before, we were created to worship God. And we must worship God the way that he asked us to. John 4, verse 24. John 4, verse 24. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. So what does it mean to worship God in spirit? That means with our hearts, with our minds, with the inner man, with the soul. We must, you see, you can come to church every Sunday, and you're supposed to. That's important. That's mandatory, in fact. As long as we're not providentially, some providential thing happens where we can't, we are to be in worship services, no doubt about that. But you come every week and you can not worship in spirit, which is just as wrong and just as bad and just as evil as not worshiping in truth, which we'll get to in just a moment. So we must worship with our spirit. We must be connected. We need to be thinking about the prayers that are said. We need to be thinking about the words that we're singing. Some people don't even sing. We're supposed to sing. I sing lousy. I'm not a good singer. I wish I was. There's been times when I've been in services that are all of the song leaders. In fact, it happened not too long ago. Here, all the song leaders were gone. And boy, oh boy, it was sad. But I don't sing well, but I'm still required to sing because my voice may not be beautiful to anybody else, but it's beautiful to God. And so is yours. So we're all to sing. We're all to be engaged. And I understand it's hard. I've been in services where the singing was terrible and the preaching was slow and the man just didn't have a lot of skill when it came to preaching. And I understand it can be hard. But we must worship with the Spirit. We must be engaged in the worship of the Lord. And we must worship in spirit and truth. For what is truth? We must do it true. We must do it the way God has laid out. There again, you can go back through the Bible and you can find all these cases where they were worshiping God, but they weren't doing it right. Read the book of Malachi. That's your homework this week. Read the book of Malachi, and you will see a people who was worshiping, but they weren't worshiping in spirit and truth. These people were worshiping, but they weren't worshiping in spirit and truth. We know that Cain had done something that was incorrect. Nadab and Abihu, strange names, huh? How many of you named your kids Nadab or Abihu? I don't think many have done that. But Nadab and Abihu, they were to serve the Lord. They were to take care of the things of the Lord, and they didn't do it right. They didn't do it the way God had directed them to do it, and fire came out and killed them. God has always cared about how his people worshiped him. And some people think in the New Testament times that just so your heart is involved. They just want the spirit worship. They don't want the truth. Got to have both. And I've seen people jump around and play on instruments and do all kinds of crazy things, have a dance in the spirit. I mean, all kinds of things I've seen and heard about. God didn't ask for those things. Those things are vain worship. Those things are real worship, and God will not accept them. So, let's look at the things that God has laid out for us to do when it comes to worship. These are the things that we see in the scriptures that God has shown us to do. That God has shown us to do. And before I go any farther, I want to make the distinction between worship and service. See, some people don't understand there's a difference between worship and service. Now, all worship is service, but not all service is worship. Understand this. All worship is service, but not all service is worship. It's kind of like if you have to kill a man, not all killing is murder. Okay, sometimes we have to kill a person in self-defense. Sometimes a policeman has to, or a soldier. They kill somebody in self-defense. That's not murder. So, all murder is killing, but not all killing is murder. Same thing with worship. All worship is service, but not all service is worship. Service is something that we do, from person to person. Okay, admonish somebody, encourage somebody, strengthen somebody. That's service. That's service. We're rendering. We're required to do service. But that's not worship. Worship are certain acts or certain avenues that we must do in order to please God. We must do the way that God has asked them to do it. So the first one we're going to look at is preaching. It's preaching. Acts 20 verse 7 says, "Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight." Long service. Long service. And I've joked with some of the sermons that I've given that I will try not to keep them till midnight. But Paul did here. This was a long sermon. And in the past, when you read about the early church, and you read about even the churches here in America 100 years or so ago, the preaching was much longer. The preaching is tending to get shorter and shorter and shorter. Preaching has kind of hit hard times here in America. And people are from the MTV generation now, when they just want quick, short sound bites. And a lot of people, especially our young people, are not trained to really listen and pay attention to long sermons. And that's sad. That's sad. The sermon is extremely important. You got to hear the word of God in order to be saved. So, preaching. What is preaching? Preaching is not being a comedian. Listen, you might say some funny things in your service, tell a joke here or there, a humorous story, but all those things need to have a purpose, and the purpose is to preach the gospel. It's to preach the gospel. I've known some preachers that think they're comedians. It's not about our own ideas. There's preachers out there that preach their own ideas, their own thoughts. I had a complaint a while back about somebody telling me about their preacher, and that he will talk about himself and stories about his life. In the last 5 minutes of his sermon, he'll throw in a couple of Bible verses. Now listen, there again, you may tell some stories about your life or some preacher stories as we call them. And that's fine there again if it has a purpose, if the purpose is to help with the preaching of the gospel. A good story can stick in our mind, and a good story can be helpful. There are stories that I remember from when I was just a child the preachers have told. And those stories were helpful and beneficial when it came to understanding the Bible better, but that's what it needs to be about. We're not here to teach the philosophies of men. We're not here to teach the latest Oprah or Dr. Phil ideologies. There again, we may use the philosophies of men to prove some point, quite often how bad those philosophies are. But it's not about the philosophies of men. It's not about the culture or the ideas of the day, which change all the time. The cultural ideas, the cultural norms, the things that the culture believes and accepts change constantly. We're not to preach the culture, we're to preach the gospel. There again, we might bring cultural things in to point out different things in the Bible. There again, unfortunately, a lot of times, negative things that's going on in our culture. But we're not to preach the culture of the day. So, worshiping God includes preaching. Make no doubt about it, God calls us together to assemble on the first day of the week. The Bible says not to forget the assembling of ourselves together, and that, of course, doesn't just mean Sunday morning. It means Sunday night, Wednesdays, or whenever it is that the leaders of the church has decided that the church needs to meet. The next thing we're going to look at is praying. 1 Timothy 2, verse 8. I desire, therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. So we are to be a prayerful people. And right now in America, we certainly do need prayers, don't we? Of course, the whole world does. But we need to be a praying people. Prayer is powerful. And there again, talking about the churches, from times past, Wednesday nights used to be called Wednesday night prayer meeting. A lot of churches call it Bible study now. That's fine. But they used to be called prayer meetings. Why? Because they spent a great deal of time in prayer. Prayer is hard. Prayer is tough. I've always been a little disappointed, when you call some kind of a potluck or a meal for the church to have together, you always have a lot of people show up. But when you call a night to get together and pray, just to pray, very few people show up. Praying is mandatory. Praying is powerful. Praying is our connection to God. Listen, God talks to us through the scripture, and we talk to him through prayer. And right now, especially, we need to be doing it all the time, but especially right now, with all that's going on, all the pain and suffering and death, the extra pain, suffering, and death, because those things are always going on, aren't they? But the extra that we have right now, we really need to be an intense praying people. Get together with other people in the church. Ask your leaders of your church, can we have a special time of prayer? And remember, God can change things. And I believe that if things are going to change, I believe in my whole heart with this plague, that if we're going to get rid of it, it's going to be because of God providentially. Either he's going to allow it to end on its own, or he's going to allow somebody to come up with a vaccine or some kind of a medicine that helps. But all those things are going to be providentially because of God. So let's be a praying people. The next thing we're going to look at that we're called to do is the Lord's Supper. Acts 20, verse 7 says, Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight, So, same passage that we looked at when it comes to preaching, we're going to look at when it comes to supper. So the Lord's Supper is to be done on the first day of the week. We see that right here, now on the first day of the week. I don't know why there seems to be so many people at this particular time wanting to go back to Sabbath worship. It's not the correct worship. We're to worship on Sundays. That's the first day of the week. And we see that the time to break bread is on that first day of the week. That's the time to have the Lord's Supper. We're not to have it on Saturday. We're not to have it on Friday. We're not to have it on Thursday. We're not to have it at weddings. We're to do it on the first day of the week. We see Paul here. Paul had been in this church here for a week, waiting for them to come together, just like us. This is when their church came together. We're to have unleavened bread. I was recently talking to somebody that I was very upset years ago because there were some shut-ins that had asked me to bring the Lord's Supper to them. I didn't have any of the bread from the church, so I went and got soda crackers because I thought they were flat. They wouldn't have leaven in them. I thought all flat bread didn't have leaven, but that wasn't true, unfortunately. So we must have unleavened bread. We must have fruit of the vine, grape juice. We're not to have water, as some churches use. We're not to have wine. We're not to have Kool-Aid. Are not to have Pepsi. You might say, why not wine? Isn't that the fruit of the vine? Listen, because this is important. We are careful about the bread, aren't we? We don't want any leaven in it. We're careful to get unleavened bread. And if you know anything about Jewish history, when it came time for the Passover, the Jewish people would sweep their whole house. They would look inside the books. They would do all kinds of things. Anything they had leaven in it, they'd give it to their Gentile neighbors. They wanted to be sure there wasn't even a crumb of leaven in the house. Well, why shouldn't you use wine? Because how is wine made? Do you know? Alcohol is made from yeast. Alcohol is made from yeast. So when you are drinking wine, alcoholic wine that is, because there can be non-alcoholic wine, but when you're drinking alcoholic wine, you are drinking yeast poop. That's what you're doing, you're drinking yeast poop. So the wine is leavened. This is when you put it in bread, it leavens it. The wine is leavened. I would no more drink wine than I would Kool-Aid or Pepsi. So we're to take the Lord's Supper and we're to take it on the first day of the week. And there's how many first days of the week in every year? 52. So we're to take it 52 times on the first day of the week. Ephesians 5 verse 19 says, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. One of the things that we're to do is to sing. And this is extremely important. You can look back through history, and whenever there was great deeds or great men, there was always great songs about them. Songs is also a way to help us to remember things. It's much easier to remember things than a song. Songs that we sing to God need to be true, because we're speaking about Him, and we're speaking truth to each other in our singing. And it must be vocal. Notice it says singing and making melody where at? On your guitar? Making melody on your harp? Making melody on your kazoo? No. It says making melody in your heart. The heart is the instrument. A lot of people in the denominational world make a big deal about the word melody. They say, melody means an instrument. Okay. It tells you the instrument to use, your heart. See, the word there, mentally solo, it never specifies the instrument. If I say I play an instrument, what instrument do I play? You have no idea. I might play the jugs. I might play the Hawaiian guitar. You have no idea unless it tells you, unless it specifies. It specifies here. It is the heart. It is the heart. It is the human body. It is the vocal cords. You actually have cords in your throat. Did you know that? Just like on a guitar. We are not to go beyond scriptures. People don't understand why the Church of Christ makes a big deal about this. Remember what I was talking about earlier about people who started worshiping God in ways that he didn't ask? Started worshiping God in ways they wanted, not the way that God had asked to be worshiped. And we remember the consequences was always suffering, problems, pain. This is why we don't add the instrument. We sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing, making melody in our heart to the Lord. Colossians 3:16 says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord." Do you know that instrument was not commonly used until 1,000 years after the church started? Oh, they started using them somewhat in about 650 years after the church started. But it was controversial and wasn't common use in the Catholic Church until about 1,000 years. And if you know anything about church history, the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church split, and the Greek Orthodox Church is actually the largest church in the world. From this day, they do not use the instrument because it's not in the Bible. Because the early church never used it. And don't get me wrong, the Eastern Orthodox Church does a lot of other things. They're not correct, but at least they kept that. If you look back through church history, all the early denominational leaders that were breaking away from the first denomination, the Catholic Church, none of them approved of musical instruments. It's almost funny that the leaders in the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, they would think it was almost heresy, or would think it was heresy, to say that it was wrong to have instrumental music in their church today. No, not have it. But the people who started their churches all disagreed with having the instrument. Look it up. Look it up. We do not want to go beyond the commands of God. Worshiping God is not about us, even though we get great benefit from it. Worshiping God, we're not the audience. God is the audience. Do you understand that? That's important. God is the audience, and we're worshiping Him. And He deserves our worship, and He deserves for it to be done the way that He's asked us to do it, and He has told us to sing. Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. Now Leviticus 10, 1 and 2. Now Nadab and Abihu, remember I talked about these names earlier? The sons of Aaron each took his censer and put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which He had not commanded them. Are you commanded to use instruments? No, you're commanded to sing. Verse 2, so fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Do you understand? There again, they were doing what God asked, but they weren't doing it the way they asked Him to do it. They're required to put fire on these censers. And there was a certain way they were commanded to do it. They didn't do it the specific way that God had laid out for them to do it. And they were burned up, disintegrated right then and there. Do you think God takes His worship serious? But that's Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Do you think He would take it any less serious, seeing how His Son died? In the Old Testament, Jesus hadn't died yet. But now Jesus died. Don't you think he would take it even more serious? Don't you think we should take it even more serious? God said, sing, and you can't show me any command, any example, any necessary inference. You can't show me any place in the Bible where the church used instruments. I'm going to stay safe. I'm going to stay with God. And I'm going to obey him on this. And it's sinful to do otherwise. 2 Samuel 6:6-7. And when they came to Nashorn's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. So Uzzah, here they were bringing along the ark of the covenant, and they were bringing it along. This is the where God dwelt in a special way. This was a holy, holy thing. And they were bringing it along, and all of a sudden the oxen stumbled, and the ark shifted, could have fell off. Uzzah reached out to stable it. You can understand that, can't you? Surely God would want to punish somebody for doing that. And he fell dead right there, right that moment. Why was that? Because he had, I'm sure, good motives. I'm sure he was trying to do the right thing, the good thing, but God struck him dead. Why? Because God had specified how the ark was to be moved, and they weren't doing it the way God had laid out for them to do it. And even though they may have had good intentions, I know people with instrumental music, well, we'll bring in more people, and the people like this, people want this, it will make people more emotional, all kinds of things. Listen, if God didn't ask for it, don't do it. Unless we have a command to do it, don't do it. Don't do it. You may say, but where's the command for songbooks or for seats in the church building or a pitch pipe? Listen, we have to understand the difference between a generic command and a specific command. God tells us to go, and he does, to go into all the world and preach the gospel. Going is a generic command. We can go any way that we sit, that we feel that is proper, that doesn't break any other of God's commands. So we can go by foot, we can go by train, we can go by internet, a lot of different ways we can go. That's a general command. But the specific command is to preach the gospel. There again, as I said earlier, we're not to preach other things other than the gospel of Jesus Christ. We need to understand that a songbook is just an aid to help us to sing. It's not a different kind of music. A pitch pipe helps to set the pitch, but you don't use it when you sing, do you? We understand these things in life. Somebody says to use a number 2 pencil on a test. It doesn't have to say, but don't use a number 2.5. Number 3, we know that we're to use a number 2, and because it says that, eliminates all the other numbers of pencils. Why is it the men pretend like they don't understand that when it comes to the Lord? We are to sing, and to do otherwise would be sinful because we would be breaking the commandments of God. Lastly, we want to look at giving. Giving. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper. There be no collection when I come. So we see here the first day of the week, Sunday, that's the proper day. That's when we ask for the offering. Some people give during the week for various reasons. Maybe they weren't here or whatever, but that's not when the church asks for it. It's on the first day of the week. We are to store up as we prosper. That means if we prosper more, we need to give more. God requires us to give as we have been given. And if we make more, we're to give more. It's not a tithe. The tithe there again is part of the Old Testament law. God done away with that. And even when people talk about a tithe, they don't really understand the tithe most of the time, because the tithe actually comes to about 35% of all that you owned. In other words, you had a field, you had to give a certain amount of that, the crop. Then you sowed the crop, you need to give a certain more amount of that, and on and on and on. Special offerings, 25 to 35%. What's sad, though, is that we are under a better covenant there. Again, we're under the covenant that Jesus died for. And some people think that it's okay to give less than 10%. Wow. We need to think about that. We need to think about that. All are to give. God has never excused either in the Old or New Testament from the poor from giving. We're to give the best. We're to give first. And we're to give from the heart. God doesn't want us to give grudgingly. 2 Corinthians 9:7. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, "So let each one gives as he prospers in his heart, not grudgingly of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver." So we're to give from the heart. We're to give because we want to give, because we love to give. And we should love to give to the church. There should be nothing more that we love to do than to give to God. Where does that money go? When we give to God, where does that money go? It goes for carrying on the work of God. It goes for if you have a building, taking care of the building. Listen, there's a lot of times I hate buildings. We have an old building here, old preacher's house, old office. A lot of problems, a lot of issues, cost us a lot of money. Blessed. But we're blessed to have them. We're blessed to have this, and you don't have to have a building. Some people have home churches, which I find tend to over time to kind of stop growing. I find over time, a lot of times, unless they do grow and start getting into a meeting place, that they don't generally continue for a long time. Generally. You can rent a place, but just like when you rent a house, you're kind of throwing your money away for nothing, aren't you? So you might ask, where is the command in the Bible for buying a church building? The command is in the command to assemble. The Lord tells us to assemble, and most people don't have houses big enough to hold the church. And as I said, that it tends to really limit the growth of the church and the continual existence of it. It goes to pay the preacher who is hopefully given his time to doing the work of God, to praying and to studying and to preaching and to teaching. It goes for evangelism, to buy these materials and things that the church needs to evangelize the world. It goes for edifying, so that you can buy the materials and things that needed to help to edify, to build up the brotherhood, build up the body. It goes for benevolence, for helping those who are needful and deserving of help. The Bible teaches a lot about helping the poor, looking out for the poor, lifting up the poor. And the church can't do that if it doesn't have money in its storeroom. So giving is an act of worship. Giving is an act of worship every bit as much as it is anything else. Giving is also a sacrifice. We're sacrificing something that we love. And if most of us are honest, if we're not in love with money, we're pretty friendly with it. And we like it. And I think most of us would like to have more of it. So when we give sacrificially where it actually hurts us at least a little bit. When I was young, I'd go out and I'd do everything I wanted to do, go to the movies, buy all kinds of food out and everything at the end of the week. If I had $5 to put into church, I thought I was just really great. How sad my thinking was then. We need to give sacrificially, which means that it might hurt us a little bit. But I'm not preaching the gospel of prosperity here by any means, because I don't believe in it, not in the least, but I also know that God will not allow you to outgive him. He's always going to give you back more than he gives you. It may not be money-wise, but he will always give you more back than you gave to him. So there you are, 5 acts of worship. We must do those acts, all of them, and we must do them the way that God has laid out for us to do them. And when I was looking out there at these other churches, I would see churches that had Lord's Supper maybe once a month, once a quarter, once or twice a year. I'd see most of these churches bring in the instrument. I would see these churches at times, most of the time, and not preaching the gospel, at least not all of it. And I would see that they were not worshiping God the way that he had asked. And therefore, that is one of the reasons why I am a member of the Church of Christ. I hope you are too, and if you're not, I hope you'll become one. Please contact the Church of Christ in your area and talk to them. Talk to them about the worship. Talk to them about being saved. I want to thank you for watching this. I really care about you. And I hope and I pray that this series will make a difference in your life. And it will help you to be a stronger Christian and become closer to the Lord. I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you once again for watching.